Ladies and gentlemen, to discuss the evolving demands of AI governance, please welcome Margaret Busse, Executive Director of the Utah Department of Commerce, Justin Lall, Principal at Gallup, and David Danks, Professor of Data Science, Philosophy, and Policy at UC San Diego. The conversation will be moderated by Rama Elluru, Senior Director for Society and Intellectual Property at SCSP.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this very important discussion on the evolving demands of AI governance. I'm Rama Elluru, Senior Director of AI Governance and Intellectual Property at SCSP. Let me introduce our distinguished speakers. We have Dr. David Danks, Professor of Data Science, Philosophy, and Policy at University of California, San Diego, Justin Lall, Principal at Gallup, and Margaret Busse, Executive Director of the Utah Department of Commerce. Our discussion today will focus on three common themes in AI governance: national security, data privacy, and economic impacts. The discussion will be informed by a poll that we did SCSP did in collaboration with Gallup called American Perspectives on AI. We will be issuing reports based on this data in the future, but today we want to use this opportunity as a teaser to talk about some of the results that we saw. And we'll start with national security, Justin. Our mission at SCSP is to provide recommendations for competitiveness, long-term competitiveness of the United States in where AI is shaping national security, economy, and society. What did Americans have to say about AI and national security?
Yeah, thank you, Rama. Well, first, thank you to SCSP for hosting this really important event and the partnership on the survey. We're very excited about the results. Just a little bit of context, this is among the largest survey that Gallup's ever conducted that's specific to artificial intelligence. We learned a lot of really interesting things. Couple things jump out to us initially when we did the survey. One, most clearly, is that Americans see AI as mission critical. 80% of Americans believe that we should be leading the world when it comes to AI, and it's across the board. This is not a Republican or a Democrat thing. Across all demographic groups, across party affiliations, Americans overwhelmingly see AI as critically important to the country and the future of global leadership. 85% of Americans actually believe we're currently in an AI arms race, meaning that we're competing with other countries to develop the most advanced AI technology. And so Americans very clearly say, one, AI is important, and two, we need to be leading in AI. But, and this is the interesting part, is Americans want to do so very thoughtfully. They want to lead, but carefully. And so what the polls told us was that while Americans do say AI is important, they also tell us that they want to favor things like slow development if it means we can prioritize safety and security. And so we asked Americans specifically, do you prioritize innovation and speed regardless of the externalities, or do you slow down a little bit when it comes to development and then prioritize things like safety, even if it means you're sacrificing speed? 80% of Americans said they would choose slow development even if it sacrificed speed. And so that move fast and break things Silicon Valley approach doesn't really apply here. Americans are much more thoughtful when it comes to development. And so the reason I bring that up as it relates to national security is that mindset of being cautious and pragmatic at the same time applies when it comes to national security. There was a specific item that we asked was about autonomous weapons. Just tactically, how do Americans think about autonomous weapons? Should we be using them? Should we be developing them? If you ask Americans about autonomous weapons, 38% say we should be using those. So less than half of the country says we should be developing autonomous weapons. The way we defined it, just for context, is weapons that do not need any human interaction to operate. We asked the same question, but now changed the stakes a little bit. Now we asked, what if other countries are using autonomous weapons? These other countries, not necessarily allied countries, are using these same technologies. Then support jumps to over half the country. 53% then says, yes, we should be using these technologies. So what that tells us is Americans are thoughtful, they're pragmatic, but they're willing to respond to situations because they see the value and the importance of artificial intelligence.
Thanks, Justin. David, Justin mentioned competition with other countries. Let's set the context with international dimensions. AI national security strategies greatly vary across nations. For example, we see vastly different approaches from China to the US to the EU. How do we address the normative tensions that have emerged from this multipolar landscape?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a huge problem, right? We're really ending up right now in a state where there are kind of three different governance approaches, broadly understood, at the global stage. Sort of U.S.-based, sort of risk and efficacy-centered approach, the EU's rights-based approach, and then the Chinese approach, which is a kind of hybrid involving significant state control. And one of the challenges this is raising is, of course, AI doesn't respect national borders in any sensible way. I mean, most AI models can go on a thumb drive that you can drop in your pocket, jump on an airplane, and it's gone. So things like export control just don't seem to work very well when it comes to the software side of AI. At the same time, companies want to be able to engage globally. And so with this tripolar world that we're finding ourselves in, I think there's increasing pressures to find ways to have essentially agreement that certain things are going to be acceptable. It doesn't mean that we have to have the same governance regime worldwide, but there need to be sort of tent poles that we can all agree this is acceptable, this is not. And that's only going to emerge through the kinds of multilateral negotiations that are quite frankly, a challenge right now, given the current global state of affairs. I personally am really excited about some of the things that Justin was just saying, precisely because they point towards an open-mindedness and pragmatism, at least here in the United States, that is going to be necessary as we move forward. If the attitude is, we know how to do governance, if you're not going to do what we do, get out of the way, I don't think that's going to succeed for any country or any political entity to have that attitude. Instead, it needs to be much more, what are the local needs, what are the needs in this country, and the needs of this AI ecosystem? And we're starting to see the emergence of that, albeit with the challenges of then sort of interoperability that arise.
Justin also mentioned that when you ask about AI and autonomous weapons, the answer is different if other nations have those capabilities. How can AI capabilities be used for de-escalation in conflict settings, particularly when we're seeing increased discussion about AI and autonomous weapon systems?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing to say is that if is no longer an if, right? We know autonomous weapons are being deployed. They've been deployed in multiple active conflicts over the last few years. I think crucially, though, we think of AI in military context and in national security context, it's often focused solely on autonomous weapons. But of course, AI is tremendously impactful on intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, ISR. It's important for logistics and supply chains. It's important for understanding what our allies, not so allies, and adversaries are thinking and planning. And if you ask any military commander, they will tell you the biggest challenge 9 times out of 10 is the fog of war, knowing what is the other side trying to do, what is the facts on the ground. And AI, outside of the autonomous weapons domain, I think has enormous potential for helping to establish better situational awareness, whether for militaries, for political leadership, for humanitarian organizations and other civil society organizations. And I think we need to make sure that we're not just thinking about AI in the form of kamikaze drones, but also the ways in which AI is transforming military and national security engagements along every dimension.
Margaret, from a state perspective, any thoughts on reconciling national security ambitions with the need for regulation?
Yeah, thank you. And I love hearing the insights from Justin and David, and thank you for having me, Rama. I think that the idea that has been propagated a bit around sort of we can't regulate AI at all or we'll lose the race to China is really a false choice. And that's why I really appreciated what Justin had to say about where the American people are. I think that the reason that we want to win the AI race is not just because we want America to be ahead, right? It's because we want it to be done in a way that preserves our individual liberties, our agency, our ability to not be manipulated and surveilled, and all of those things which we know that China doesn't necessarily want, right?
Exactly.
And so if we're not willing to look at those things, then why do we even care? if China gets ahead, right? And I think what's interesting about the data that Justin told us is that there is an excitement about AI and the possibilities and the need for it, but there's also a hesitancy because we've seen how some of our big tech companies have used their technologies in ways that have exploited people. Utah was the first state actually to pass a law to regulate social media to protect our minors after it came out that there had just been really bad harms to our kids because of social media. And so I think because of those things that there's been a growing recognition that we need to be cautious as we're developing technologies and put appropriate guardrails on them. From a state perspective, we feel like we've done a really good job in our AI policy in terms of balancing the ability for our companies to innovate, but also to be able to protect the public and enable us as government to observe and learn.
And you touched on some challenges like social media, but let's also talk to focus on another challenge, data privacy, that the public is very interested in. Without comprehensive federal AI legislation, what measures are states like Utah taking to govern AI, especially with respect to data privacy?
Sure, so thank you. One of the things that we did in Utah last year is we set up an Office of AI Policy. And this office basically has two functions. One is to actually offer AI companies regulatory mitigation, where we can actually help exempt them from current regulations that never contemplated the use of generative AI. We also set up a learning lab that would take on certain issues within AI where we might see some harms or where we might see over-regulation or regulation that needs to be changed, study it, bring in stakeholders, and make recommendations to the legislature. So we stood that office up, and the first thing we decided to study was actually the use of generative AI in these mental health chatbots. So if you think about data privacy for a minute, and you think about mental health chatbots, so now you're putting in your most sensitive data about yourself, right? And we know that the default business model for a lot of these companies has been to collect your data, sell it, and serve you up targeted ads, right? And by the way, make sure that you're engaging as much as possible, which can also be potentially harmful to your mental health. So what we recommended to the legislature, which was passed into law, was that for these kinds of mental health chatbots, you can't share or sell the data, and you cannot serve up targeted ads. So that's one thing that we've done specifically in there. We have an overall data privacy law that we're now looking, it was passed about 3 years ago, before kind of this explosion of AI. And so now we're looking to update it. The other thing that we did just this past legislative session that specifically has to do with social media platforms, it's called the Utah Digital Choice Act. And what we did there is it was almost more about not so much privacy per se in data, but data ownership. Because I think that's really what we're getting at. It's not just privacy, it's not just, I don't want my social security number compromised. It's, I want to be able to own and control my data. And so what this law did is it basically said, when you're using a social media platform, you have to be able to download and access all of your data, everything, your whole social graph, your followers, your friends, everything. And then it requires social media platforms to create interoperability so that you can transfer that data anywhere you want. So you control your data. It's not that they own your data. That shifts the whole paradigm of you being the product, your data being the product, to you being the customer.
Thanks for those great.
Can I just jump in really quick?
Of course.
Margaret, it sounds like Utah is doing a really good job of listening to its citizens, because that's exactly what we found in the survey. There's a couple of things actually that you mentioned that were exactly aligned with how we saw Americans saying they wanted their data to be used. The big takeaway from our survey on data privacy is that Americans do not want to be free use data donors. They want to have some sort of transaction engagement in not only the type of data that's being used, but also how it's being used. We actually asked specifically about mental health and well-being trackers when it comes to what would Americans be okay with. And so when we ask questions about would you be open to sharing cell phone data that's just taken from your cell phone, but for a good purpose like health and well-being, only 13% of Americans said that's okay. 87% of Americans said, no, that's not okay, but I love what you're doing, which is users telling the system what they want to tell it. On the type of data being used, we ask Americans, what about emergency services? Can they use your data? The answer is still, it depends on what type of data. 70% of Americans were okay with sharing their location data, for example, with emergency services, but only 25% of Americans would share their child's data with services that were supposed to do child safety. So it really depends on the type of data and the use of that data, and that really determines whether Americans will or will not be engaged with these types of legislations.
Thanks, Justin. David, I know you have some thoughts on the functionality of how data is used and whether that can be governed. But I also want to talk to you, want to have your thoughts on another aspect of these AI models, and that they're black boxes. How do policymakers address the challenges of their constituents not necessarily understanding how these models work?
I mean, it's not just the policymakers and the constituents, it's often the companies themselves don't know exactly how the models work. I think, there's a kind of consistent theme both to the black box and the issues of sort of data and how do we think about data. And I think what that comes back to is the importance of thinking about outcomes. Not just thinking about trying to regulate data as this object that gets passed back and forth, but thinking about what gets used, what the data are used for. Thinking about not so much what happens inside the black box as how do I as a company, I as a government agent, use the outputs of those black box in practice. And so there I think the key is for us to start thinking about sensible kinds of governance on the use of AI, on the use of data. In California, for example, we have CPRA, which says that if you use data to make an inference to something that would be protected if you measured it directly, you have to treat it as if it's protected. So if I make an inference about Justin's health status from not health data, I now have to treat it as if it's HIPAA protected, for example. Those kinds of things that focus on the uses, I think, have a lot of, they create the kinds of constraints that actually promote innovation. I mean, there's often this mindset of governance and innovation are opposed to each other, and somehow if we create more governance, then we're going to reduce innovation. The short version is sometimes, right? If you think about sort of increasing amounts of governance or regulation, it's an inverted U, to use the sort of academic framing of it, in terms of the impacts on innovation. If you have large amounts of regulation, then absolutely, you can add, if you're adding more regulation, you're going to harm innovation. But if you're in a low regulation, a low governance space, adding more governance actually increases innovation. Take the example of the Utah law. If I own my data, suddenly there's 1,000 startups that could be created because they can get the social media data instantly without having to create the kind of infrastructure that, say, a Meta has. And I would argue when we're thinking about AI and data, we are in a low governance space right now. So increasing governance actually will increase innovation in AI if it's done intelligently. And there I think it needs to be focused on uses and outcomes, not on how many flops did it take to train the model, for example.
Right, yeah, that is one of the SCSP perspectives as well, is that we should govern AI by sector and outcomes. Let's turn to workforce and economic implications of AI. Justin, is there any optimism in the SCSP Gallup polling about AI's impact on jobs? And what are Americans' concerns when it comes to how AI will impact our economy and businesses?
Yes. My favorite answer on panels is, it depends. Two words that are important. Before we get into that, I just want to say a quick note on governance, because there were some really fascinating findings that aligned everything that you just said, David. With governance, we find that when we ask Americans who gets to make the rules for AI, there was no clear winner, but there was definitely a clear loser. Americans overwhelmingly said there's two organizations or two groups. One is government. Government should be making the rules for AI. 53% of Americans said that that's the right answer. This was a select all that applies, so people could select multiple things. The other clear winner here was consortiums of organizations working together. These could be private companies, these could be independent experts working together, but a consortium-led approach or a government-led approach were kind of those answers above the top. The loser here is individual companies making regulations themselves. Only 16% of Americans supported that type of framework when it came to regulation. The same thing, so we asked a question about regulating AI and creating the rules. We asked another question about testing new services. And same kind of category here. 73% of Americans want independent experts to be testing the new services. Only 48% said the government should be testing. Even less than 40%, said that independent companies should be testing their own services. So to your point, David, yeah, governance is not an enemy to innovation. It's that condition for public trust that drives innovation. Without that governance, we don't have the public trust, and therefore we don't have the innovation that we need. Sorry, to get back to the original point about workforce. There is split views on workforce. At the macro level, Americans are optimistic. Overall, Americans see AI as something that's going to drive economic growth. 53% of Americans believe that AI is going to boost the economy. Even more so when it comes to productivity, 61% of Americans believe that AI is going to increase productivity in the workplace. And that's a little bit more macro level findings. But when you ask questions individually about jobs and work, particularly about job creation, 60% of Americans believe that AI is going to destroy more jobs than it creates. So a bit of a sobering finding there. What's even potentially more sobering, only 20% of Americans believe that those displaced by AI are going to be able to find new jobs. And so what does that mean when it comes to policy? 73% of Americans are in support of policy or programs that would develop AI and workforce training for those that would be displaced or need new skills when it comes to AI.
Thanks, David. Justin mentioned increase in productivity and some optimism there. What do you think, which industries do you think will have the most increase in production because of AI?
Nice, simple question. If I knew that, I'm not sure I would be up here. I might be investing in some companies right now. No, I think the challenge is that all of the research and early empirical findings is that AI does not eliminate any job category. What it does is it eliminates or replaces tasks within a standard job category. So suddenly you can get away with 5 people instead of 50, or you can retask people and have them doing more. The challenge that raises, and where I think that some industries and some opportunities arise, is now you have to manage a group of AI systems. We know a lot about how to manage human beings. We're not always good at it, but we know how to do it. We don't know how to manage AI systems. We don't know how to train, you said, training. We don't know how to train somebody who's 22 years old, fresh out of college, to essentially have the responsibilities that we've historically given to a 30-year-old who's got 10 years in the industry. We don't know how to accelerate people to the point that they can actually use AI intelligently. We're already seeing signs of this in the tech industry, where lots of companies are firing or no longer hiring entry-level coders, because the AI can do a good enough job. But they're not getting rid of their senior software engineers. They're not getting rid of the software architects, because those are the people who know how to build the systems that then the AI can fill in. But then where's the next generation come from? So I actually think that there's an incredible opportunity that's available to accelerate people's learning and capabilities through those things that we used to say you have to do this in entry-level jobs. Now it's how can we use AI to accelerate people through that, to get them to mastery level, to get them to be experts across all sectors. So it's not one sector, it's rather within each sector. I think there are opportunities if we think about how do we accelerate people to levels of expertise that used to require decades of work experience.
Margaret, David mentioned training government workers to use AI. What should the government's and industry's roles be in training the future workforce to be AI literate? And maybe you could start with explaining what that means, what AI literate means.
Well, I would just say, to riff off of what Justin said, is that there's an incredible amount of uncertainty how this is going to affect the workforce. We just don't know. We think that there will be increased GDP, but we don't know how uniformly that'll be distributed, right? We just don't know. But I think there is so much anxiety about it that no matter what, government needs to do something. And I think that one of the things that government should be doing is prioritizing this AI literacy 100%. Now, I've heard, some universities and even K-12 schools are sort of like, we can't even use any kind of digital product in our classroom because of it being compromised by AI or learning being compromised by AI. So they're going back to blue books, right? And I don't think that's the right approach either. I think there really needs to be a whole different framework for pedagogy. Can I say that word? Can somebody say that
Pedagogy.
word? Pedagogy, thank you. For how to teach kids to think critically and using AI to enhance that and helping them to learn how to use the tools as effectively as possible in ways that enhance their analytical abilities. So that's the first thing. I do think governments need to think very clearly about how they're going to upskill and reskill workers that probably will be automated out of jobs ultimately, and have their eye on that. And it's going to be evolving, just like the technology itself. We're trying to keep our eyes on with our Office of AI Policy just where there might need to be regulations or regulations cleared away. The same thing needs to be done with workforce. There needs to be an eye on this at all times so that we can help people where they're struggling. I think that's the role of government. The market's going to sort out a lot of this, but as we know, there's been a significant disruption in our workforce already because of trade and other kind of automation that maybe increased our GDP overall, but caused political anxiety. And that's what we have to be cautious of. We can say, yeah, it's gonna help us on the macro level, yeah, but what does it do to whole populations, and what does that do to our democracy?
Thank you. David, do you have anything to add in your perspective as a professor?
I was going to say, pedagogy, you're speaking, that's my world most of the time. And it is exactly the challenge you're raising, which is, we know that when technologies are introduced, people de-skill. They lose skills they previously had. I'm of a generation, I could drive a manual transmission car once upon a time. I've de-skilled over the last 20 years. I'm not as good at it. And so the question that is, I think, one for all of society. It's not for me as a professor to make this call. This is why I'm so excited about the Gallup results, and I can't wait to get to see them in full, is what are the things we're okay with de-skilling? We were okay with people becoming less good at spelling because of spell check. We're not okay with airline pilots being de-skilled on landing an airplane. No. We want them to keep that skill. So things like critical thinking, I think we need to not de-skill in critical thinking, and AI risks that, and that's why people are having to take these kinds of measures in educational context. Other things, I'm perfectly, the ability to read lots of documents and start to summarize, maybe I am okay with people de-skilling a bit in that, maybe. But again, that's not my call. That's our collective call, and I'm looking at all of you as well. This has to be a publicly engaged discussion about what are the skills that we think are crucial to being a citizen in America and in the globe today. And what are the things that we might lose or de-skill if we outsource too much to AI? And we have to confront that head on, whether we want to or not.
Thank you for those insights. So last topic, giving our timing, let's address the growing concern of disinformation and misinformation. David, how can policymakers address these increasing capabilities of image and video generation AI models? And is watermarking sufficient?
No, watermarking. So watermarking is not sufficient. Telling people it's AI generated or it's disinformation is not sufficient. We know that those kinds of labels don't usually work very well. So the short version is, I think, I guess I have a somewhat pessimistic view here, which is that I think that the real solution to dis and misinformation is about empowering us all as information consumers, rather than government trying to regulate or govern things directly. I think the move needs to be to say all of us need to be better about consuming information critically and thoughtfully, and government can play a role in promoting that, but I don't think there's any technical solutions on the horizon.
Margaret, how are states filling the gaps when it comes to addressing misinformation and disinformation?
So I think about half the states have passed legislation around deepfakes in political advertising to sort of either criminalize it or put some penalties on that. The question is, how do you know? And I do think there's some interesting technologies around sort of provenance or watermarking that could be helpful, but probably bad actors can always get around it to some degree. Some people talk about how there's technology within the internet protocols that basically they kind of eliminate the spoofing kind of websites, and how that could be a standard, not so much from a government regulation standpoint, but just from this is what the responsible companies do. So if you're not seeing the watermarking, if you're not seeing the provenance, then you know that there's something's up, right? But I also 100% agree with David in that we will all have to get smarter. We are all used to when we see a photo or we see a video, we think that that is truth, right? In ways that we don't necessarily think something is truth when we just see a written word or somebody say it. Same thing if we hear a voice. We think that that is the person, right? And now that's no longer true. So we have to start to be more discerning. What I'm fearful of the most about that is that we start, not trusting anything.
Yeah, I think that is one of the challenges, one of the biggest challenges that these models are presenting. Now, we are at time, but please look out for reports based on the SCSP Gallup polling results, and please help me thank my panelists.